Welcome back. We're going to try storytelling with our example dashboard. And this time we're going to look at some data that we might not typically have access to explain the learning and performance measures that we have within this dashboard. So if you guys remember, we're looking at Professor Q's organic chemistry class, and Q's clearly an anonymized label here, at Big State University. And we've got the cleaned up version of this, right? So we've got things sorted by quiz average. So the people with the highest quiz average are at the top, and the people with the lowest quiz average are at the bottom. We have the distribution for the semester put into the grades, and we have not just the average, but the distribution by the quizzes. Now, let's do this and let's look at a heat map that shows the quiz grades that are here in this top left corner across all the students in the class. Right? It might be really difficult right away to pick out the low grades. The first one that I saw when I was just looking at this distribution was this 60 here. But if I looked a little closer, there were some other lower grades. Here's a 62. I'm just kind of picking things apart. Here's a 45, a 63, a 65, a 68. Maybe we also want to pay attention. These are all the failing grades, it looks like. Pay attention to the grades that are sort of on the cusp, who's making C's. That might also be important if we're looking for trends. So we see that there might be some particular students that we want to focus on if we were looking at a heat map rather than looking at the information that was over here. We don't necessarily want to put this information into a heat map for an instructor, although in some cases that might be the most effective piece of information. But we do want to think about, okay, how can we highlight, which students need help? Specifically, we want to look at how we can be better storytellers, right? So to do that, I'm going to take you back through these heat maps where we see sort of the cascading information about, who's performing in ways that might need additional support, right? And then storytelling goes better with names, right? So we're going to give names to these 5 students that got highlighted. We're going to call them Jerry, Freddie, June, Rajat, and Laura. Now, if we're going to tell a story, we should start with the intro to a good story. So, once upon a time, there was an organic chemistry class at Big State University that had 22 students. Through an early alert system in the class dashboard, 5 were highlighted as being likely to fail the exam. Their names were Jerry, Laura, June, Rajit, and Freddie. Here we have the dashboard highlighting those 5 students, and we put their names in instead of those numbers because that makes it easier for people to follow. Jerry seems to be doing the worst. He did okay on the first 2 quizzes, but he's been scoring lower since then. Let's look at Jerry's scores. Right? Here's his quiz scores. If we just give them in an isolated fashion like this, we have no anchoring other than whatever the teacher pays attention to when they're looking at the score. They may not even notice that we're starting at a 50 here, and this may look really, really low. We've not anchored it on a failing grade here at 70, and we certainly haven't shown the teacher what other people are scoring in the class, which may also help to contextualize things as well, at least in some cases. Now, again, we've just talked about social comparison being bad. That's particularly important when we're doing a student-facing dashboard, but with a teacher-facing dashboard, it is possible that we might want to indicate differences between quizzes where everybody performed well and just one person was off and where the entire class was struggling. Right? So here are the quiz averages for the entire class. If we give them in separate graphs like this, it is very difficult for people to make comparisons. If we put them side by side, it might be easier. Okay? We could try to do some further anchoring by just showing, how close he was to the particular range where most of the quizzes were showing up, where the quiz averages were showing up. And if we wanted to do that instead of putting in the individual quiz grades, it might look something like this. right? But since we've already converted this section of the dashboard to a box and whisker plot, which you may remember from the previous slides, right? One thing that might be nice to do is to go ahead and put those sort of side by side with Jerry's scores. So when we compare Jerry's organic chemistry grades to the quiz distribution for the class, where we have both the averages and the standard deviations being given, we can see that in some cases he's, more or less within range, and in other cases there's a pretty enormous gap between Jerry's performance and the rest of the class, and that might indicate a higher support need than we would be able to see otherwise if we were just giving the professor information like this, right? And we're really pushing towards storytelling, so that means that we should be giving as complete information as possible. Again, this is a higher ed organic chemistry class where we assume that there should be a fair amount of data literacy among the professors that would teach it, and so this box and whisker plot could be really used to our advantage, right? Hmm. Actually, it looks like Jerry didn't do that great on the first two quizzes once we have the class averages and standard deviations as an anchoring device. So let's keep using those, right? And we can see, oh yeah, even though he was performing better, right? If we just had looked at the you know, the raw score that he was performing better on those first two quizzes. He's still, well below how the rest of the class is performing on those two quizzes, and we want to pay attention to that. All right, let's go back to our storytelling. Jerry seems to be doing the worst. And Jerry was struggling from the very beginning. In fact, his scores are lower than the other struggling students identified by the system. Laura, June, Rajit, and Freddie are also struggling, but their scores are better than Jerry's. And let's look at those in the same terms that we had for Jerry, that we decided would work very effectively. So here's June's organic chemistry class quiz grades. And we can see in general, June, even though she's been flagged as having a problem, really is within range or above average compared to her classmates. And it's really just quiz 3 where we're seeing her struggle. Rajit, on the other hand, is not performing quite as well as June, but is really only struggling on this one quiz right here, right at this 70. It just happens that he's below average on enough quizzes that he's been flagged by the system as somebody that might need additional support. And then we have Freddie, who is below failing on one quiz and in the low range on the second quiz, but is otherwise outperforming many of his other students. And finally, we have Laura, right? So Laura is, again, performing in range or above range on several quizzes. Here she seems to have the top grade in the class, but she has a couple of grades that are at the failing mark, right? Or just at the low end on the average scale. So let's go back to storytelling mode. We're in Once Upon a Time, Part 5. Right? After looking at how these students compare to the box and whisker plots, their instructor, Doc Cool, looks back at the dashboard. So she sees that these 5 students are highlighted, but she's looked at them and some of them seem to be having bigger problems than others, and there's not a consistent pattern uh, to which quizzes they're struggling on. So she starts thinking about it a little more. There's no process data on the dashboard, so Doc Cool decides to tell these students to study more. No, wait. She finds some other drill down options in the individual students. She looks at the first student, Jerry, and is horrified to see that he's studying more than 10 to 20 hours a week just on her class. How is he possibly able to manage this with all of his coursework? So let's look at a dashboard that shows Jerry's scores against the box and whisker plots of the class average, right? And then this might not be a great visualization because we have so much data happening here, but it does have an advantage in that it's overlaying the hours studied, again, with a different axes measure running on the right. so that we can see the overlap between how he's performing versus how much study time he's putting into things. Right. So if we look to the left here, we see that the minimum value for his study time is 9 hours a week, and then it goes up over the 20 mark in quiz 4, even as he's performing really, really poorly. Right. So just telling Jerry to study more is not only not helpful, it's probably going to be exceptionally discouraging and demotivating. Armed with this new information, Doc Cool calls Jerry's advisor. She finds out that Jerry is a first generation college student. He has a scholarship, so he doesn't have to have a job, but his home high school had no calculus courses. So even though Jerry aced his chemistry course in high school, he's now struggling in organic chemistry as he tries to take Calculus 1 at the same time. Doc Cool automatically convinces her dashboard to provide us with a look at which quizzes in our class require significant knowledge of calculus. Now, here we have the percentage of calculus based problems per quiz against the box of whisker plots and Jerry's grades here with the stars. And that's a little messy. So we're just going to reduce that information by highlighting the quizzes that require significant calculus information to be able to process them. And we see that, he's performed poorly on quiz 2, but the quizzes in general where he's outside of the standard deviation or just at the very bottom of it, the class distribution, um, shows that he is um, really, really struggling the most in cases where there's a high amount of calculus. Right? So simply telling him to put in more hours, right, isn't going to help, right? Because it's the calculus that's driving the problem and not the lack of effort. It's now clear that Jerry is working very hard, but needs additional support in calculus. Doc Cool is relieved that Big State University is so dedicated to providing free tutoring to deserving students. Then she arranges for Jerry to get additional calculus tutoring that cuts his study time in half going forward. She leaves the calculus setting on when she pulls up Rajit's information. Hmm, it doesn't look like calculus is the problem. First, she looks at Rajit's grades, then she adds his study hours. She doesn't understand why he isn't studying in week 3, but then she sees he has a job in the library. Now, again, if we overlay all this information, it isn't entirely too much information. We have hours studied outside of class being given here, right? So we have, a significant amount of studying, almost 25 hours um, in week 5, right? Very low studying in week 3. So he's trying to make up for it um, in the following 2 weeks, right? Uh, but what really seems to be driving things here is he's got this 60 hours of work, again, on a different scale. So do as I say, not as I do, in this dashboard, um, where he's working just excessive numbers of hours in his part-time job. Mystery solved. Doc Cool talks to the library supervisor, who tells her that Rajit felt bad when another member was out sick. The supervisor assures Doc Cool that they'll be sure to push back on Rajit when he says he can fill in, and they certainly won't let him go over 40 hours in 1 week ever again. Doc Cool is thrilled that Rajit is such a responsible student. She makes sure that he knows what to study to make up for the work that he missed that week, given his relatively strong performance. Otherwise, she's no longer worried about him failing the final exam. But now she has to figure out what's happening with the other students. So she looks at June and at Freddie. June seems to be doing really well, except for quiz 3, and it doesn't appear to be related to her calculus skills. Freddie also seemed to be doing relatively well on a lot of his quizzes, and again, the calculus quiz difference doesn't seem to be driving his issues. June and Freddie are both studying off campus, and so the learning system where they do their homework and reading is not logging any of those answers. Neither of them work for the library, and they don't belong to the football team, so Doc Cool doesn't have any other contextual information to figure out what might be happening. She uses her lunch break to call Mr. Knight, their advisor, to see what he knows about their situation. Mr. Knight doesn't know anything about Freddie, but he says that June met with him in week number 4, and she'd just flown back from her mother's funeral. Doc Cool looks at her dashboard. Wow, June must have had quite a shock and then just thrown herself right back into her studies. She offers to let June retake quiz 3. So let's look at this dashboard. Here is June's original score, and here's the score that she received when she was allowed to retake it, which is a totally appropriate thing if somebody has just gone through such a big shock, right? Now, what to do about Freddie? Doc Cool talks her TA, Kim Overbergt, who says that Freddie usually participates in class. He even helps other students. But there have been a couple of times when she's seen Freddie at the peanut barrel for Thirsty Thursdays. Kim noticed that Freddie seemed a little under the weather during the Friday morning quizzes after that. What days were those again? Kim checks her calendar. Huh, it might be the 2 weeks that he was struggling on his quizzes. Doc Cool is annoyed. She's running late for a faculty meeting. Plus, she likes Freddie. She doesn't want him to fail the final, but she also doesn't want to scold somebody who's clearly an asset to the class. She asks Kim to make sure that Freddie is studying, and they send him some extra practice sets to get him ready for the final exam. And because Doc Cool was such a great and dedicated professor who tracked down all this contextualized information, they all lived happily ever after. Now, you might imagine this is a great fairy tale, but that the average college professor doesn't have time to do this. And in fact, in some cases, it would be very invasive if they did, right? So the next video is going to talk about the ways that we might frame information to keep people from overinterpreting data that is available in dashboards.